Now,
Hi, I'm Dr. Ian Fairlie. I'm a director here at 100% Renewable UK Limited. Today we're going to discuss how an energy system based on nuclear power balancing the renewables doesn't work. And that instead, a 100% renewable energy system is essential for the United Kingdom. My colleague, Dr. David Toke, will then outline the main points of recent research that we've done, that we've published. And after that, myself and co-director Herbert Eppel will join the discussion by posing some key questions. Okay, over to you, David.
right, thanks. My name is Dr. David Toke, and I am going to give a talk about can nuclear power and renewables coexist. And this is important because the British government has published various models with nuclear power playing an important, substantial role in the electricity system in the future. According to their models, about half our energy is going to come from electricity, the rest from hydrogen and oil and gas, some of which will come from oil and gas, some of the hydrogen will come from oil and gas, and some of the hydrogen will come from renewables. Well, we don't think it's very practical to have the hydrogen coming from oil and gas, and you can look on our website for arguments to that effect, but we're focusing on electricity here now, and I think for the most part, we at 100% Renewable UK would envisage most of our energy being associated with electricity, perhaps some from hydrogen. So electricity is very important, but we certainly are against the idea of there being a nuclear contribution to renewable, to help balancing renewables. In other words, we think renewable energy should constitute all of the electricity production, indeed all of energy output in general, with some energy being derived from electricity, for instance, in hydrogen. But we don't see the argument for helping balance renewable energy using nuclear power. It's been said to be essential by this government. But we say, well, actually, people don't know about how nuclear power imbalances renewable energy. According to the government model, I think, broadly speaking, about 20% of electricity is going to be supplied from nuclear power in their scenarios. Well, we can tell from our research that we commissioned and which we analysed on what's happening with electricity production given the grid constraints in Scotland, that having a system which is mostly composed of renewable energy and nuclear power doesn't work, because essentially the nuclear power pushes off a lot of electricity from renewable energy off the grid, forces it offline, wastes it. And this point is obscured at the moment by the way that the electricity balancing system works, whereby a lot of electricity coming from offshore wind is constrained. That is, the wind farms are closed down because there's too much electricity coming on the grid. And you can see the balances in Scottish electricity production here, and you can see that it's changing from year to year. We analysed 2 years, 2017 and 2019, because they had different balances of proportions of electricity coming from nuclear power and renewables. And you can see in 2017, there was roughly the same from nuclear and renewables, just over a third from each. But in 2019, wind power, well, renewables in general, had taken over. I mean, even in 2017, renewables were generating the majority of production. It's just that other renewables includes things like biomass and also solar power and hydro as well, which is about 10% of Scottish electricity production. In 2019, of course, by far the large majority of electricity produced in Scotland was coming from renewable energy, and the majority of that from fluctuating renewable energy sources, that is mostly wind power and a bit of solar. And you can see the nuclear proportion had dropped to just below a quarter. In other words, broadly the same as what the government envisage in their scenario for 2050, with, of course, renewables in 2050, according to the government, are going to be even a higher proportion in terms of fluctuating renewables, at least, than even what was being generated in 2019. So we have a good idea of what will happen to the electricity system if it pans out as the government suggests, with it being composed of about 20% nuclear and most of the rest coming from fluctuating renewables, wind and solar PV. And what's happening in Scotland is not very good, and it's obscured by the system in Scotland. Now, in Scotland, the point is the electricity grid has not been sufficiently quickly reinforced enough to allow enough capacity to contain electricity production when there's a lot of it, you know, when it's a very windy day. And this is a sort of signpost for what will happen for the electricity system in the UK as a whole in the future. Because, of course, in the future, the whole of the UK's electricity system is going to have a much higher proportion of fluctuating renewables. And so, like Scotland, the whole of the electricity system is going to subjected to these new challenges to which the system needs to be adapted, but which the Scottish system hasn't been adapted. And the problem is that there's too much nuclear. Well, if there's any nuclear on the system, it isn't flexible, and because it isn't flexible, it won't power down to accommodate for the fact that more electricity is being produced, and so something has to be cut off or constrained. And it's always the wind farms. Why? Because the wind farms are much easier to close down than the nuclear power stations. And of course, there have been regular complaints from anti-wind farm protesters that the wind farm operators are being paid money to stop producing energy. Well, that's because nuclear power would cost a lot of more money to close down. So actually, wind power are the virtuous agents in this business of balancing the electricity system. It's nuclear power that are the problems, because they can't or won't close down. And of course, as I say, this has big issues for the rest of the UK in the future, as the proportion of fluctuating renewables increases to the sorts of levels we already see emerging in Scotland, and there's a big ratio of inflexible nuclear production aside from that. And this is a chart that was drawn up by a company called Cornwall Insight, very well respected energy consultants who we commissioned specifically to look at what happened with the electricity system and what happens to the amount of wind that needs to be curtailed, potentially at least, if nuclear power stations had been closed down in 2017 and 2019. And this sort of acts as a sort of meter for what would happen if nuclear power was very flexible, so that it could close down when there was excess electricity production on the Scottish grid that couldn't be carried by the interconnectors going south and so on. So this is a good way of finding out, that is, what would happen to the amount of wind that would still need to be curtailed if there was no nuclear power production at the time that there was excess electricity production. How much wind would still need to be curtailed? And you can see in 2017, there were about, this works out as 16.9 terawatt hours of nuclear energy production. And you can see that almost as much wind could have been produced. That's the final column, potential additional wind generation. Almost as much wind could have been produced if there had been no nuclear production as what in fact was curtailed. So in other words, in 2017, if there'd been no nuclear power production, at least during the times when there was excess electricity production beyond which the Scottish grid could cope with, then virtually no wind need to have been curtailed at all. If you go to 2019, well, even then, when there was much smaller nuclear production because one of the two nuclear power stations in Scotland was mainly closed down during that year, even then, and despite the fact there was a lot more wind generating, even then, the large majority of wind curtailments would not have happened if there had been no nuclear production during those times of excess electricity production as far as the Scottish grid was concerned, if you look there. And in fact, 77%, even in 2019, of wind that was in fact curtailed would not have been curtailed had nuclear power been fully flexible to account for the excess production. Whereas in 2017, this figure was up to 94% of wind power that was actually curtailed would not have been curtailed if there was no nuclear energy production. So quite astonishingly high figures there. But remember, this is the sort of result that will happen if the whole of the UK grid, or when the whole of the UK grid has to deal with large amounts of fluctuating renewables and substantial quantities of nuclear power, if we have a grid production that essentially consists of just nuclear and fluctuating renewables. But another statistic I would like to draw your attention to in this table is look at the proportion of wastage of wind power compared to the proportion of nuclear production. In 2019, which is most like the government's scenario in terms of proportions of the different fuels on the grid for 2050, you can see that actually you get about 1.4 terawatt hours of wind wasted compared to about 11.7 terawatt hours of nuclear production. So in other words, you're busy producing all this nuclear power, but a substantial proportion of it is in fact taken up with wasting wind power. So this is a big cost to the system, potential cost to the system. Well, it's an actual cost to the system as far as Scotland is concerned, and it will be a very big cost to the system in terms of using nuclear to try and balance renewables, because attention is always solely focused on the idea, oh, you can keep nuclear power stations running, well, for most of the time, not all the time, but for most of the time. But people don't look at the other side of that. It is very bad at balancing fluctuating renewables, and there is a high cost to that nuclear doesn't have to pay for. And the government is proposing in future that it's renewables that pays for it, because they get forced online, and instead nuclear power stations can be kept operating for as much as they can. That's the government solution. But in effect, it's loading the costs onto nuclear power and making it even more expensive than whatever the formal costs are in terms of premium price contracts or cost overruns, which people will have to pay for the nuclear power that's built. So far, Hinkley C is being built, and there are proposals to build Sizewell C, and negotiations as we speak ongoing with the government about how to fund that. We know nuclear power is not getting any cheaper. So this is a summary on this table, and just explaining what I said. And of course, as I say, it's not just that wind power's being wasted here, it's that a substantial proportion of nuclear production itself would in effect be wasted in a British wide system with these sorts of proportions of nuclear and renewables, because the nuclear will be forcing wind power and solar power off the grid completely. And in Scotland, around £100 million could have been saved in wind power compensation payments each year if nuclear power had not been producing any energy, at least in the times when there was excess production off the Scottish part of the grid. So to summarize then the implications for government's net zero projections, we can say that Scotland is a very clear red flag for the future of the British electricity system under the government scenario of it mostly consisting of either nuclear or renewables. And the Scottish system is and the Scottish position that we've analysed is very similar, most similar in 2019, except of course there'll be even larger proportion, according to the government, of fluctuating renewables, which will make the situation worse than in 2019. So we can say there'll be a tremendous amount of wasted renewable energy for which the renewable operators will pay, but not the nuclear operators. And there are some very substantial proportions here, very substantial as far as the amount of nuclear production, actually, because nuclear production is actually smaller, might be 8% or 9% of wind power production, but it's actually a larger proportion of nuclear production. So will nuclear power operate flexibly in the future? Well, the answer is no, it won't. Although people do say that pressurized water reactors, which is what is being put online through Hinkley C, and if it happens, Sizewell C, etc., are supposed to be more flexible than the power stations in Scotland, Torness and Hunterston B, which are so-called AGR, advanced gas cooled reactors, which are old, dilapidated, and not very flexible anyway. But although PWR power stations are supposed to be flexible, in practice, this is irrelevant for the British system because the contracts issued, the incentives issued by the government, these enormously profligate prices that for a nuclear power station to be paid, that the government is giving EDF for the electricity from Hinkley C, and no doubt similarly in different ways for Sizewell C. This means that nuclear power stations will stay online to get these prices for as much as they can, because they're paid for they're paid on the basis of the same rate for whatever they produce. It's got no relation in the contracts to what the actual power prices are on any half hour, because the British system measures it, as do all systems these days, measures electricity prices half hourly. And of course, as there's more and even excess electricity on the grid, the wholesale power prices go down for each half hour. And if you have excess electricity production, they go negative. Now, in future wind farms, right, this is future contracts for wind farms, mean that the wind farm operators will get nothing for if wholesale power prices are negative, which means they'll go offline. Okay, they may put it into batteries, store it, whatever. But the point is, the nuclear power stations will just carry on churning stuff out, even though it's worthless. In fact, of negative value to the grid, they'll carry on generating. This is a wasteful technology, and they'll do so regardless of all these technical arguments, because it's what their contracts that the government is giving them incentivize them to do. And so they'll seriously undermine the operation of of renewable energy and of the electricity system itself, wasting tons of money that could be more usefully, we argue, be put into developing, well, operating 100% renewable energy system. It would be cheaper by this very token. And this is because, as you see from these notes, there are different contracts for future schemes for nuclear compared to renewables. The government carries on piling on the discrimination in favor of nuclear power in financial terms and against renewables. It gets worse and worse as time goes on. So there'll be incredible wastage of renewable energy through the contracts and through the way the system operates and is regulated in future, according to the government's scenarios. So what do we do instead? Well, we can have 100% renewable energy. We can store the renewable energy in various forms. I mean, experts argue with themselves about what is the best storage mechanism. There are numerous alternatives, but the big energy companies and the government completely ignore this sort of thing, because the government essentially is advised through various reports that are paid for by the big energy companies. And they say, oh no, we must carry on with nuclear power and also fossil fuels in a decarbonized fashion. Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? But 100% renewable energy system is something that an increasing number of people are interested in, and an increasing number of people realize has intrinsic advantages over a system of nuclear power and fossil fuels that sort of adapted to a net zero carbon system, and they don't really work because they work for a different age, where you had a fossil fuel based dispatch system as opposed to decentralized electricity system, where the system is much more of an integrated whole and demand and supply sides work together. And that's what we need to develop in this country. Now, people say, oh, well, isn't it going to be expensive to store energy, particularly for long periods? Because granted, we know that there's periods in the year, maybe lasting for a few days, where there's not much wind or sun, and we need to store energy for the long term. Well, sure, but and that might be sometimes, it might be expensive. Well, certainly at the start when you're building the system. But let's look at it that way. Nuclear electricity is expensive all of the time. So if you're going to store renewable energy, even if that stored renewable energy is fairly expensive, you won't need that much of it compared to the whole year, will you? Compared to spending very high prices per unit to generate nuclear power for the whole of the year. And of course, apart from that, wind power and solar power is becoming as cheap as chips. And anyway, I'm not going to go through the details of the system, but it's a cheap alternative system. Gas engines, which you can use to generate stored renewable energy in various forms. There are lots of different options for that. It's not no time to go into all the arguments for the different options today. But these are very cheap. Less than 1/20th of the cost of building a nuclear power station for each unit of generating capacity. So potentially 100% renewable energy system is a lot cheaper. And we ought to move on to that. So I think I want to stop sharing now and go on to some questions. So I think, Ian, you're going to ask a question first.
Yes, thank you, David. There is a question about the fact that other countries, for example, France, their nuclear reactors go up and down. They're not inflexible. So tell us what the difference is here. Why can't we do that?
Well, the reason that we can't do that is because the position of nuclear power as against renewables is rather different in France as compared to the UK. In France, not only does nuclear power generate, I don't know, about 70%, 70 to 75% of electricity. I don't know what the exact figure is at the moment, compared to electricity compared in France. But also, and this is very important, you have lots of renewable energy produced in particular from Germany that comes onto the French grid that cannot be controlled by the French regulator. The French regulator cannot tell German wind farms to stop turning. They can't close them down like they can in the case of the British system to British wind farms. And so what does the French system do to avoid overload? Well, it has no alternative but to try and get the nuclear power stations to shut down and to load follow. There are arguments about what this does to the nuclear power stations, of course, but anyhow, that's the main difference. And of course, if you might think, oh, well, how come we don't get wind power from Germany or somewhere else flooding onto the British electricity system because we have interconnectors onto the continent? Well, there's a simple reason for that and that's because our interconnectors are different, of a different type to the ones that are connected up on the continent. We have, this has got nothing to do with Brexit, by the way, this is to do with electrical connections. The fact that we have so-called high voltage, direct current connections with the continent as opposed to high voltage alternating current connections as they have in the continent, which are much less controllable. So we can stop these flows coming on. Well, we could go on discussing this till cows come home. It's a very complex subject, but that is the essence of it.
Thanks for that, David. I know that it doesn't affect us here in Britain, but I'm worried about the fact that this practice that the French do of load following in their reactors is in fact potentially very dangerous. And it's, to be honest, it's astonishing. Now, whether in fact any PWRs are going to be built in Britain, any new ones that is, going to be built in Britain, still a moot point. We don't know whether Hinkley C will ever operate or not, or will ever be finished, or whether Sizewell C will be finished or built. Um, there's no evidence right at this very minute which suggests that they will be able to operate these reactors flexibly. Not that I've seen. Obviously, French EDF they keep their cards close to the chest, and they don't tell us anything about these things. But I don't think that we should let EDF off the hook on this issue. Ramping up and down nuclear reactors is a bad thing to do on a regular basis. It's without going into too much detail. Basically, you have to very finely gauge the ratio of fast neutrons to slow neutrons. Fast neutrons you cannot control, slow neutrons you can to an extent. Now, to do that at the beginning of a cycle and then a year later at the end of a cycle, fine. But to do it every day is, in my view, little short of technological overconfidence, hubris, in fact. And we should not be doing that here in Britain. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. And Herbert?
Yes, thank you very much.
Question?
Very interesting, very illuminating. And you started talking about storage, that storage in various forms is becoming more and more important, but you didn't say that much about the actual fuels that we will use to store renewable energy. Maybe you could elaborate a little on that aspect, the actual fuels for storage?
Yes. I mean, one reason why I didn't elaborate is because I've noticed on sort of email discussion groups, the experts tend to scream at each other saying, oh, I favor this option, and somebody else says, no, I favor our option, it's much better than that. And somebody else chimes in, no, I've got this option which works and yours other two don't. And so it goes on, very tiresome. So, but there are a range of options. I mean, I must say you've got to distinguish first between the short term and the longer term. For short term purposes, we've got an increasing amount of battery capacity, which you can use to even out the supply and demand throughout a given day. And particularly as we get more electric cars, there's great potential for using the batteries in electric cars through so-called vehicle to grid storage. I mean, that's completely free resource. It costs nothing. And you've got increasing amounts of battery capacity for various purposes. So fine, that's intraday trading, and there's going to be plenty to even out the balance between a given day's supply and demand production, wherever it's supplied from. But the question is, what happens at those times of the year where maybe for a few days you get very little or no wind or solar? So you need long-term energy storage, and you need a system to deal with that. Well, the main way of dealing with that is, of course, by storing renewable energy through electrolysis of you electrolyze water, for instance, to produce fuels. Now, the obvious answer to that is hydrogen. People know you could use electricity from wherever. We intend from renewable energy to produce hydrogen. But that's not the only substance you can get from that. You can also simultaneously create ammonia, which is used very widely in the fertilizer industry. And at the moment it's produced through the same system that's used to produce hydrogen at the moment from fossil fuels, mostly natural gas these days. But by the same token, as you get hydrogen from fossil fuels these days. But the point is, I mean, why ammonia, which is an otherwise nasty substance? Well, it's very storable, and it is stored, admittedly under the right industrial conditions, but it is done. So therefore, why can't we do it for some other purposes? That's an argument there. You can also store hydrogen, but that's less easily storable because of its chemical properties. You can sort of put it into caverns and things, but then you need the caverns, right? With ammonia, you've already got big tanks which you can squirrel away in some industrial park or other. But so there's two there. There's lots of other options as well, of course. You can use stored water in various ways. Water balloons. Again, you need the storage areas to do that. That's possible. Using caverns again or something like that. People talk about pumped hydro. Now, yes, certainly there's pumped hydro has many uses. On the other hand, there's limited resources of pumped hydro because you're depending on the geography. There are also ordinary hydroelectric power stations, which can be used to a certain extent as effective storage mechanisms. But again, there are limitations to the resources. There are other things. There's flow batteries, because these are much cheaper way of storing energy than electricity batteries, than the normal lithium ion batteries. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but let's put it briefly. If you're going to use lithium batteries only very occasionally, like you would with long-term storage, that becomes much too expensive, quite apart from how much lithium you'd need or whatever, or what have you. But with flow batteries, this is much cheaper because your storage mechanism is a cheap chemical rather than the lithium, if you see what I mean. So that's one big option. That's another big option. There are other options. There's also synthetic fuels, which you can make, again, through electrolysis. And this involves direct air capture as well, taking the carbon dioxide from the air, using the renewable energy to do that. And you can produce synthetic fuels, you know, like you might put today in an airplane or a car engine or something or other. But you can store that. Obviously, we know how to store that sort of stuff. And you can weigh up the costs and benefits of doing all these things. Then some people argue, oh, no, you don't want to do that. You want to use geothermal energy as a storage mechanism. There's some big plans for doing that. And some people say, oh, you need liquefied air. And you could store things in that, or compressed air, and so on. And people talking about the costs, relative costs and uses. I mean, all these things have their uses somewhere in the storage system, from short to medium to long-term storage, I'm sure. But, you know, but the trouble is, biofuels. People talk, what about biogas? That's another one, you know. Yes, I mean, I'm sure all these things have their uses, but what we need to do is to set up markets and mechanisms so that we can get the cheapest and most practical means for a given purpose. That's what we mean to do. That's what we need to do. And of course, have demonstration schemes for all of these ways of storage energy. That's the way we need to. I've gone on quite a long, but we need, of course, engines to burn or process these fuels in. But the gas engines or gas turbines, with minor adaptations perhaps, are very cheap, extremely cheap objects in all this system. But we'll need that as
Yeah.
well.
Yes,
Love these systems.
thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I mean, personally, I've been a fan of the hydrogen economy, so-called hydrogen economy, ever since I first heard about it more than 30 years ago. And the concept is certainly very, very attractive. But as you said, in the context of recent discussions, I've sort of learned that surely hydrogen cannot be the only solution. And essentially, I think the bottom line is, as you said, we need markets for different technologies. We need to develop different technologies, and essentially, we need to fire on all storage cylinders, really, to put it short. And in order for as a baseline for future discussion about hydrogen, we've actually, maybe it's worth mentioning at this point, we've developed, we've put up a hydrogen position statement on our website, and I was going to encourage listeners to this Zoom session, in any case, to visit our website at 100%renewableuk.org. For much more information. There's a wealth of information, of background information, recent reports. And if you support our aims, please do join in the discussion via our email group, which you can sign up to. And in particular, if you live in Scotland or have some other connection to Scotland, maybe you go there for holidays or have relatives there. We have a petition at the moment on our website to urge the Scottish government specifically to ensure that all Scottish energy comes from renewables, not just electricity, all energy by 2050. And that is our current campaign aim. And so please go to our website, and thanks for listening, and maybe see you in our e-group. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
So, bye-bye.